This video will cover Chapter 7 on bargaining, where we'll just talk about some of the steps in the bargaining timeline and talk about bargaining more broadly. We'll discuss things like the bargaining structure and coming to an agreement. So before bargaining begins, both parties engage in information collecting. Information is collected to attempt to determine the interests of both parties, the options for achieving those interests, looking at external benchmarks of fairness, in other words, what are other companies doing, what's standard in our industry. Both parties are attempting to assess the other side's interests. What is it that the workers are looking for? What is it that the company needs in this time? And they're thinking about what's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, if we can't come to an agreement, what is our next best alternative? So here we have the bargaining timeline as structured in our textbook, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. You'll see that on both sides, they're starting by choosing their team and beginning to do those reviews of the external benchmarks, collecting information, reviewing the current contract. The employer is going to be looking not only at what the current contract is, but what's the experience that the company has had under that current contract, and what is the current corporate strategy and financial goals. Both sides will be thinking about a strike contingency plan. What's going to be happening in the company and in the union if they happen to go to strike? On the union side, they'll also be discussing the issues with the national union. Before they reach the bargaining table, both sides will have developed some bargaining proposals and agendas. Both sides will have some target that they hope to hit, some minimum or maximum that they hope to gain, and they will have developed strategies for how to engage in the process. 60 days before the end of the current contract, or 60 days before the strike deadline, both parties must notify the other party and the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services of their intent to bargain. So they must notify each other that they're ready to start, and they must notify the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services that bargaining is going to begin. When bargaining begins, the two groups start by establishing ground rules. Those ground rules will be how negotiations will proceed, how they'll take turns talking, all of those kinds of things. As you saw in Final Offer and in American Dream, there will be multiple negotiation sessions where the groups come together and talk over and over again. There will also be what's called internal negotiations or internal caucuses. That will be where the union folks go back and talk to each other and or the business folks go back and talk to each other without the other side present. They want to be able to discuss their strategy or the proposals they're hearing or trade-offs that they could make without the other party hearing it. In that bargaining process, we're also going to do what's called contract costing. In other words, how much is this contract going to add to or subtract from the current status quo? So if we give the employees raises, for example, how much additional cost is that going to add to our costs for our organization? And what's the impact going to be on the profit to the firm? During bargaining, the two parties will reach what's called a tentative agreement. On the company side, they will prepare for debriefing of the managers. They want the managers of the company to know how the process went and what the final decisions were. And if it looks like the union may not accept the agreement, they may begin strike preparations. On the union side, the union members who were elected to represent the union debrief the membership on the process and the results of the bargaining. They conduct what's called a contract ratification vote. In other words, the union has to vote in this contract. Otherwise, the bargaining must continue or the union would go out on strike. The union also has to obtain national union approval, usually, on the contract. If it looks like the workers are not going to accept the contract, the union may begin strike preparations. Once the union has voted in the contract is signed and goes into effect. Bargaining can occur along several structural lines. One way is to have decentralized bargaining. This would have the local union at the bargaining table with the local workplace managers. Local unions then are responsible only for the local workers, and there's no need to think about what's going on at other workplaces with other workers. There can be multi-site bargaining. Multi-site bargaining works by having multiple workplaces that have multiple local unions, all working for the same company, come to the bargain table. So this is actually the case for John Deere. John Deere has multiple unions, I believe it's 8, for the different work sites. So Harvester Works in East Moline actually has a different union than Davenport Works. Those local unions all come together to the bargaining table and bargain with the John Deere managers when it's time to negotiate a new contract. You could have something that's industry-wide, where multiple companies come to the bargaining table with many local unions. Pattern bargaining is what we saw in Final Offer. GM was attempting to get the contract in Canada to look like the contract that happened in the US. GM US sat at the bargaining table with the local union and drafted a contract. Those contract terms then were brought to the table in Canada with GM Canada. GM Canada then attempted to impose those contract terms on the Canadian workers. That would be pattern bargaining. It also could be across multiple companies. So this could be Ford as Company A and GM as Company B, for example. This picture represents some general idea of what the bargaining structure looks like in certain industries. So bargaining can occur along craft lines and can be multiple employer, single employer, multiple plant, or single employer, single plant. That would be very decentralized. In things like construction trades, we see it being bargained along craft lines, but at multiple employers. You can see things like teachers. Teaching is a craft. You have a single employer, but multiple plants. So the school district, but that school district has multiple schools. And then you see things like a single employer, a single plant. So we see hospital workers are often in a craft, single employer, single plant contract. This means if we have a company that owns multiple hospitals, they may have multiple collective bargaining agreements across those various hospitals. We could also have industrial contracts or multiple skills. These are more broad contracts. We see a more centralized contract in things like coal mining and steel. Also, the hotel association. These broad contracts we'll also see in things like automobiles and farm equipment. This is where John Deere fits in. They have a broad contract that covers many different skills across their plants. It's a single employer contract, but a multi-plant contract. And then you can also have multi-skill, single plant contracts. This is less likely to happen, but it is possible. There are 4 sub-processes of labor negotiations. 4 things that are sort of going on at the same time, or at least can be. Those sub-processes include distributive bargaining. You can think of distributive bargaining as how are we going to divide up the pie? The company generates a certain amount of revenue. How are we going to divide up that revenue? This often is focused on things that are considered sort of adversarial or conflicts of interest. This typically occurs at the bargaining table between labor and management. So you would think here about kind of win-lose scenarios where there's a trade-off. If the company gets more, the workers get less, or vice versa. Integrative bargaining is really joint problem solving. This is one where we work together for mutual gain. I often think of this as like a win-win scenario. This also occurs at the bargaining table and in brainstorming sessions between labor and management negotiators and their committees. We're looking for ways here really to increase the size of the pie. So this is how it creates a win-win scenario. If we make the pie bigger, neither party has to give up something to get something more. Attitudinal structure. So attitudinal structure really has to do with trust and relationship. how are we going to interact with each other? How are we going to treat each other in this process? So this has to do with attitudes, relationship, trust building. This occurs at the bargaining table, but it also can spill over into other aspects of the business. And then intra-organizational bargaining. Intra-organizational bargaining is that internal caucusing that happens. So the groups go back and attempt on their own to create some kind of consensus within the group. So this would be, for example, when the union goes back and just talks about things from the union perspective and trying to make the workers better off. We saw that in final offer often when the union was sitting around the table and the different union guys from the different plants for GM were kind of arguing with each other and attempting to come to an agreement. The same thing could be happening, or probably would be happening, on the company side. We just didn't get to see that in that movie. This is actually often very complex because those guys are attempting to find a best solution for their issues. It's something that the workers will actually approve. This does not happen at the bargaining table. You would not want to have these internal negotiations in front of the other side of this bargaining. So this is going to happen away from the bargaining table within the organization. So the Hicks model of strikes gives us an idea of why a strike might happen. So the left side of this shows what's called a large contract zone. The right side shows that there's no contract zone available. When we say contract zone, we mean a place inside which the two parties can find an agreement. So we have here WES. This is the expected strike wage, right? At what wage do we expect the workers to strike? So we think that the workers will strike at this wage. Now each side has their view of what that looks like, which makes this even more complicated. But let's keep really simple for right now. At this wage offer, let's say the workers will strike. In reality, the workers are going to strike at some wage, maybe a little bit less than this, because when you go on strike, you also experience cost to the union and to the workers. So if the expected strike wage is here, and we subtract the cost to the union and the workers of going on strike, we will have an expected wage that's right here. If we look at that strike wage and we add to that the cost to management of going on strike, we get an expected wage, or an expected expense really, of right here. So we should be able to find a wage that we're willing to pay the workers that's somewhere between here and here. We should be able to find a wage that management is willing to give and the workers are willing to accept. There is a zone inside which we can come to a compromise. However, if the expectations are very different, then we may not be able to find a contract zone. So if the unions have an expected strike wage that's very high, and when they subtract out that cost to the union, we end up with this very high wage, but the company has some expectation that the strike wage is actually down here. When they add the cost to management of the strike, they end up with a number that's quite low. Management is not willing to go above this. The workers are not willing to go below this. There is no zone inside which they can come to an agreement. So here's an example of this, looking at just wage increase. Suppose that the union wants a minimum of a 2% wage increase. The employers are willing to give a maximum of 5% wage increase. Now, typically, neither party knows that this is where they stand. But we can see if this is the union's expectation or desire, and this is the company's willingness, they should be able to come up with some kind of agreement inside the settlement range. However, if we have a case like this, where the employer is not willing to give more than 2%, and the union expects to get at least 5%, there's no place for them to come to an agreement. There's no overlap between their desires. As the two parties are bargaining, they're attempting to secure an agreement on their own terms, but they're trying to get somebody else to agree with them on their own terms. This can be quite complicated, which is why we see often both distributive and integrative bargaining. There can be a lot of theater to this, As we saw in final offer, there were things that were happening on the front of the stage and things that were happening in the back of the house that we didn't see. So we're going to see some of that theatric kind of as we go through these ideas here of distributive and integrative bargaining. When we have distributive bargaining, we see things as a conflict, where under integrative bargaining, conflict offers the opportunity to see common interest. For the imagery, you can imagine this fixed pie, where for integrative, we're trying to increase the size of the pie. In distributive bargaining, we get stuck in our positions, right, and not thinking about the broader picture. Where in integrative bargaining, we're thinking about what are my interests, what are your interests, and can we find overlap. When you have distributive bargaining, you don't necessarily have to have trust. And in fact, trust can be hindered by this process. If we're trying to do something that's more integrative, trust is critical and actually often needs facilitated by an outside person. When you're doing distributive bargaining, information is tightly controlled, where in integrative, it's free-flowing. Participation in each of these processes also looks different. In distributive bargaining, typically only a lead person on each side is really actually doing the bargaining. That should look like final offer to you. In a more integrative environment, we're going to see all team members involved in the negotiation. If we have multiple heads put together, we could probably come up with a better idea. The tactics are very different also. So in distributive, we may manipulate the perceptions of the positions. This actually creates more delay and causes problems. In integrative scenarios, we use brainstorming and facts. We use objective criteria to make decisions. Remember, I mentioned that we might talk about theatrics a little bit here. In the distributive bargaining, you'll see things like table pounding, right? It's very theatrical. Where in integrative bargaining, you're going to see things more like flip charts and computer screens to try to brainstorm. In distributive bargaining, we have that win-lose scenario, where in integrative bargaining, we can create joint gains and also stronger relationships. What are the risks of these two strategies? Well, distributive bargaining, we may seem very aggressive. It may harm relationships. We may not give enough credence to the worker's perspective or the company's perspective, and we may not innovate in our contract, which may mean we also don't innovate in our production process. In integrative bargaining, both sides could be seen as selling out or giving up too much. The difficulties for negotiators in each of these things. Distributive bargaining is very stressful. You saw in final offer lots and lots of F-bombs getting dropped. In American Dream, you saw them attempting to start to just rewrite their entire contract because they didn't know what the heck they were doing and they were so stressed out. In integrative bargaining, they have a difficulty of feeling like they're not in control of things, and also being able to go back and sell to their constituents the results of this bargaining. Also, integrative bargaining takes more time. We have to have butts and seats to be able to do this kind of bargaining. Some things left out there as questions. In distributive bargaining, how can we prevent the adversarial tactics we're using from damaging the relationship between management and the workers? That's a very difficult thing. The question mark with integrative bargaining is less painful. How do we distribute the increased gains that we've made? Distributive bargaining sometimes is called adversarial bargaining, hard bargaining, or traditional bargaining, where integrative bargaining is sometimes called win-win bargaining, mutual gains bargaining, or interest-based bargaining. In sum, distributive bargaining is about position, where integrative bargaining is about joint problem solving. At the bargaining table, both parties are required to bargain in good faith. This is a requirement of the National Labor Relations Act. Also at the bargaining table, there are things that both parties are required to negotiate on if the other party brings it up. They're required to negotiate on things like wages, hours, and the terms and conditions of work. There are things that they're allowed to bargain on. Those things are called permissive bargaining items. These things that are not considered mandatory or illegal can be bargained on. There are things that are illegal to bargain on. These would be things that violate the law and are not allowed, such as paying wages that are below the minimum wage. So we have to follow the rules and laws in our jurisdiction when we engage in bargaining. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.